Okay, can I get everybody's attention, please? Everybody sit down. Hello, my name is Rhonda Rohrbacher. I'm proud to serve as the New Hampshire State Coordinator for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for President. And I'd also like to recognize my fellow state coordinator, Eric Jackman. And I'd like to recognize the Honorable Dennis Kucinich, former congressman, longtime champion of liberty and the national campaign manager for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president. The interest in this campaign has been extraordinary, and this historic pivotal moment starts right here in New Hampshire. So if you'd like to get involved, please see me or Eric afterward or visit kennedy24.com. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Tucker. President and founder of the Brownstone Institute. And Dr. Tucker is a profound thought leader for many of us. And his writings helped me better articulate to my fellow pro-liberty friends why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the strongest choice for president for those of us who strongly value liberty.
A few minutes ago, somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, are you with the New York Times?" I'm not. I mean, that's probably the worst thing that anybody's ever said about me. So, we're gathered here on the month 40 after the lockdowns began. And we all know what that meant. It was the long, dark night of the soul. A lot of pain, a lot of suffering. There were many people at this event who were points of light. That belief in freedom, that belief in human rights, the willingness to speak, the courage to act. It challenged us all. Our speaker today is, for me, the strongest, brightest, most brilliant light of the last 3 years and 3 months. He showed us the way. He showed us what it means to have hope, what it means to have courage, what it means to have that sort of rigor and attention to fact. And most of all, I would say that he has borne a lot of the slings and arrows for a lot of us. I think we all owe him a great gratitude. This country owes this man a great civilization owes this man a great debt of gratitude. Help me give a warm Porcfest welcome to a hero, a man of courage, the man of the hour, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Hello, Porcfest. Thank you, everybody. I'm very proud to be with a lot of people who value freedom in the United States of America. I had, in August of 2020, when the pandemic just started and they were just doing the lockdowns and all the other stuff, I went to Germany and gave a speech in Berlin. And the estimates of the crowd there were 1.3 million, and it was the most extraordinary crowd. It looked like Woodstock. There were people from all over Europe. People from the MC was a man from Ghana. We had Buddhists, priests. We had Hare Krishna people. You have people from every kind of ideology, left, right. First time coming together and saying, somebody is stealing our freedom. And this is something we all need to unite about. And the crowd, again, they said 1.3 million people, and nobody was wearing a mask. And that was, at that time, that was a kind of heresy. And there was an NBC crew from the United States there, and they were all masked up. And they said to me, why aren't you wearing a mask? Aren't you scared of COVID? And I said, there's things that I'm a lot more frightened about than COVID. And they said, what is that? And I said, that would be losing my constitutional rights and having my children grow up in America where they don't enjoy the kind of rights that I took for granted as a boy. And we saw during COVID this extraordinary thing happen to our country, where all of a sudden people, the capacity, the fear, the orchestrated fear, almost disabled the capacity for critical thought among so many Americans, people who we loved, people who were family members, people who we grew up with, and we all assumed shared the same value systems that we did. But all of a sudden they were okay with censorship, and the government began, going through the Constitution. They started out with the censorship, which they began very, very early. I started encountering it by the end of January of 2020. Things that I said would disappear from Instagram posts. And by the way, I'm accused of passing misinformation. But I would, misinformation, as we know, is just a euphemism for anything that departs from government orthodoxies, whether it's it has nothing to do with accuracy or inaccuracy in their nomenclature. And we know this because they acknowledge that in the Twitter files, and they acknowledge that in the, the emails that we now have between the government officials and Facebook, where Facebook is saying, well, you're asking us to censor things that are true, but that they may be dissenting against government policies, and they all agree that that's right. So we saw the right of free expression. Hamilton, Madison, and Adams all said we put it in the First Amendment because all of the other rights are dependent on that. If a government has the capacity to silence its critics, it has license for any kind of atrocity. And that is what unfolded as soon as they found out that Americans would put up with constraints, with government-ordered constraints on free speech. They began this attack, this assault against all the other amendments, all the other rights in our Constitution. The other sort of second leg of the First Amendment is freedom of worship. They closed down every church in this country for a year, with no scientific citation, no due process, no notice and comment, public hearings, no environmental impact statement. And by the way, you can do things for emergency, but you can still go through the democratic process. You could still have comment sections and public hearings and environmental impact statements, but none of that was even tried. I've spent 40 years suing companies and agencies for trying to subvert or shortcut the regulatory process, which is part of democracy. There was a big question throughout our country's history about whether regulatory agencies were even constitutional because they were outside of the democratic process. The Congress, yes, can pass laws. The Constitution says Congress can pass laws. The court said, okay, regulatory agencies can pass laws, which is outside of the Constitution, but you have to incorporate a regulatory process, and it has to be strong, which means you have to do you have to do a public notice. You publish what the law is going to say, so that everybody knows in the newspaper of records, in ways to calculate that every citizen who is affected by this new law will learn about it in advance. You give the public a period of comment. You do an environmental impact statement that outlines all of your scientific citations and all of the expert opinions that underlie it. You look at the cost-benefit analysis to every sector of society. You look at whether there's alternatives that can accomplish the same objective that are less burdensome to the public. These are all legal requirements. And then you have a 60 or 90, 30, 60 or 90-day comment period in which the public, every member of the public can comment, and all of those comments have to be responded to. Oh, for example, if there's a mass regulation, and I own a kayak company, and I say to the government, I can't force my clients to put on masks because it could kill them in an emergency. That would be the kind of comment the government would say, okay, then we'll carve out something for outdoor sports or something like that. That's why you have those comment periods. And none of that was done. And then you have an administrative finding that's published by the administrative judge. And then that's appealable. So the whole thing in a court and up to the Supreme Court. So it's all incorporated in the democratic process. But in this case, it was all forgotten. And we just had one bureaucrat who'd been 50 years in office and never been elected, who says 1 week, put on masks, and the next week, or 1 week, masks don't work, which he's saying in private and publicly, but privately he's advising his boss at HHS, don't put it on, they don't work. Oh, later he said, I just said that to reduce the demand on masks. But he was telling that to his boss, you personally should not put on a mask because they don't work. So he's a 50-year bureaucrat who's never been elected, who then, mandates all these diktats for the American people, completely separated from the democratic process. So after they did religion, then they went after freedom of assembly, which is the third leg of the First Amendment. We were all told to social distance from each other. And then they go after property rights. They closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process and no just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And then they go after jury trials. Oh, here's what the Seventh Amendment says. It says, no American shall be denied the right of a trial before a jury of his peers in cases or controversies exceeding $25. There is no pandemic exception. They didn't put that in the United States Constitution. And by the way, the framers knew all about epidemics. There were two epidemics during the Revolutionary War. One of them that decimated the malaria epidemic that decimated the armies of Virginia, and then a smallpox epidemic that actually took place in this state, Vermont and New Hampshire, with Benedict Arnold's armies that were on their way to Montreal. And they ended up taking Montreal, but having to leave because they didn't have the manpower to support the occupation. So Canada would have been part of the United States, but for that smallpox epidemic, arguably. And the framers of the Constitution knew all about that. So they knew about epidemics, and not only that, but between 1780 and at the end of the Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution, there were devastating epidemics in every city in the United States. There were smallpox epidemics, yellow fever, cholera epidemics that killed tens of thousands of people, including family members of many of the framers of the Constitution. And yet they did not put an epidemic exception in the United States Constitution. The Constitution was written for hard times, not for easy times. And during the Civil War, when the Confederacy was sending up spies and provocateurs to the northern cities to drum up draft riots, which were devastating the morale of the northern states at a time when the Union was about to fall apart altogether, Abraham Lincoln knew who these people were. and they were arresting them when they came into the cities and holding them without trial because there wasn't evidence. They knew who they were. So he suspended habeas corpus. And Justice Taney, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said he can't do it. It doesn't matter. It does not matter that the life of the Union is at stake. It doesn't matter that the lives of tens of thousands of Americans are at stake. You cannot suspend the Constitution. Yeah. Oh. As I said, that doesn't mean we can't have emergencies in this country, declared emergencies, and have temporary suspensions. But not for a year, not for 2 years. And by the way, you do democratic processes along the way. And then we got rid of, with the Fourth Amendment prohibitions against warrantless searches and seizures, with all this intrusive track and trace, and we have to give our medical records in order to go into the public square, in order to leave our home. All of these things were against the American tradition, against the Constitution, and they should have been troubling to every American, and especially the press. And instead, the mainstream media in this country, which has always been the forefront of the guardians and the protectors of our Constitution, particularly first expression, free expression, all of a sudden, they forgot their role as the role which Learned Hand said the role of the press is a posture of fear or skepticism towards government proclamations. And they should have known that. The New York Times had to apologize to the American people for supporting its role in the run-up to the Iraq War, because they believed government officials. And at this end, they never learned the lesson, which is that the role of the press is to speak truth to power, not to function as propagandists for the powerful. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that should trouble all Americans, that we should ask questions about. And, people are going to say, the press, the mainstream media who's here today is going to report that I did a paranoid conspiracy theories, which is what they always say. But I'm just going to tell you facts, okay? And then I'm going to ask you, are these things that we ought to be able to talk about in a democracy? Are these things that we ought to be questioning? Is that reasonable that we ought to be questioning? And the thing that I'm going to talk about is the role of the intelligence agencies in the pandemic, in almost every aspect of the pandemic, which itself, I think, should be surprising to most Americans. This is a public health crisis. This should be the province of NIH. Why are the intelligence agencies playing this role? Why is it that in the organizational charts that were classified before they were declassified and handed over to VRBPAC, which is the FDA committee that ran Operation Warp Speed, and they declassified it in order to show it to that committee, so we now have it. Why is it that the lead agency in COVID planning was the National Security Council? Why is it that the lead agency for operations was the Pentagon? Why shouldn't they be FDA and CDC and NIH? Why weren't they regulating the health crisis? And on the NSC, the chief security advisor of the NSC is Avril Haines. Now, Avril Haines has played a role in pandemic response for decades. And Avril Haines was, just so that you know who she is the woman, she was the deputy director of the CIA, and she's the one who masterminded the cover-up of the destruction of the torture tapes at Guantanamo. And then when the Senate was investigating those crimes, it's a crime for Americans to torture people, the CIA was bugging the Senate committee which is utterly illegal, and she masterminded the cover-up of that crime. So she, and instead of being punished or criminally prosecuted, she was promoted to the highest spy in America, the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, which means she takes the prime seat at the National Security Council. Where else have you seen Avril Haines? Well, if you read the last chapter of my book, which I think on Fauci, which I think is the most disturbing chapter, it goes through this history of pandemic preparedness simulations that occurred beginning in 2001, and that predicted a series of pandemic. The first one in May of 2001, which was called Dark Winter, predicted a smallpox attack on Washington. And this was 5 months before 9/11, and a week after 9/11, you had an anthrax attack on the U.S. Capitol and on, media outlets around the country, and I think 5 people died, 22 people were infected. This was at a time immediately after 9/11. Somebody took the Patriot Act off the shelf, and let me give you a little background on this. We had a bioweapons program after World War II, and the first act of the CIA in its history was called Operation Paperclip, which was launched in 1947, about a week after the CIA was founded. So the CIA, OSS, had been dismantled after World War II because our leadership, Republicans and Democrats, agreed that having a secret spy agency was inconsistent with democracy. Secret spy agencies were associated in the American mind with the KGB in Russia, with Stasi in East Germany, with Savak in Iraq, or in Iran, with the Gestapo, etc. But they were inconsistent with the democratic system. So people were very nervous. People were very nervous on both parties about authorizing this. But in the end, Truman allowed it reluctantly and signed it into existence, but as an espionage agency, which is spying, which is information gathering. It's not dirty tricks. And that came later through a bunch of crazy machinations. But the first act of the CIA, the first project was Operation Paperclip, which was bringing the Nazi scientists who had worked on missiles, nuclear weapons, missiles and bioweapons over to the United States, to Fort Detrick and to some of the other high security labs in Texas and elsewhere in our country, to begin developing a bioweapons program, and to get the Japanese scientists, who were the only ones who would ever actually use bioweapons against the Chinese and killed many, hundreds of thousands of Chinese before and during World War II with bioweapons. And they had the most extensive program, and they got those Japanese scientists also to come over to our country, and they opened labs in Japan, which we occupied at that point, and developed bioweapons there. And the CIA was in charge with the Navy and some other Pentagon agencies of developing the bioweapons program. By 1969, they had achieved what they bragged about in internal documents as nuclear equivalency. They could kill huge populations of people around the world at a cost of about 29 cents per death, per life. This is what they were bragging about, nuclear equivalency. And so it was very, very dangerous. And a lot of people said we shouldn't be developing bioweapons. Why? Because once you develop them, you have now a blueprint that anybody in the world can use. So it is the poor man's nuclear bomb. Nuclear weapons, no matter, even if you have a formula, it takes huge economic commitments and technical proficiency to develop one. But if you have the formula for a bioweapon, you can make it in a garage. A lot of critics within the Pentagon said we shouldn't even be doing this, because what we're doing is we're making these weapons accessible to people who can use them against us and who have very, very low risk themselves. And so in 1969, Richard Nixon did something extraordinary. He went to Fort Detrick and he announced the end of the bioweapons program. Unilaterally, the American government was going to stop developing bioweapons no matter what anybody else in the world did. And then 3 years later, they signed the bioweapons treaty with most of the major nations in the world, and we're not going to make bioweapons anymore. But there were this cohort of people within the CIA. The CIA, Nixon closed Fort Detrick. They turned it over to NIH. But and they destroyed all the bioweapons. But before they destroyed it, the CIA went in and got cultures of all of them and moved them to warehouses in New York and elsewhere. And then there were an angry group of people in the CIA and the Pentagon who for many years were trying to restart the program, and they began doing it illegally. The Russians found out they did it too. But they were doing it secretly, and it was very, very low profile. And in 2001, after the anthrax, or after the 9/11 attack, somebody pulled off the shelf the Patriot Act, 342 pages. I want you to guess who the only member of Congress was who actually read that act. There was only one copy provided, unlike every bill. Everybody else voted on it without having read it. And one of the things that nobody knew was in there was a provision that did not directly revoke the Geneva Convention and the Bioweapons Treaty. The Geneva Convention made it a hanging offense, a capital offense to do bioweapons development. But you could still do research, right? You couldn't use a bioweapon under Geneva. So, but the bioweapons charter that Nixon said got rid of it all. You couldn't even study it anymore. And the only guy to read it was him. And what the Patriot Act said in this hidden provision is that, yes, we still ascribe to Geneva and we ascribe to the bioweapons charter, but any federal official who violates those treaties cannot be prosecuted. That's what the Patriot Act said. So it restarted the bioweapons arms race. But the Pentagon was reluctant to do it itself because it was a hanging offense still. And in case there was, the bioweapon, in case the Patriot Act was regarded as, as irrelevant, was found to be irrelevant as a court, it was a big jeopardy to start doing this. So they took the $2 billion a year, $2.2 billion, and instead of doing it themselves, they sent it over to NIH, to NIAID, and they made Anthony Fauci the spear tip of bioweapons development in our country. And they gave him a 68% raise and attached to his military research. So he had to do this research. He had no choice. And then in 2014, when three bugs escaped from his labs, and those escapes were highly publicized, and Congress had hearings on them, et cetera. 300 scientists sent letters to President Obama begging him to shut down Anthony Fauci. And Obama ordered Fauci to stop all of his experiments. 18 of these gain-of-function experiments that were shut down by Obama, ordered to be shut down in 2014. Did Fauci do it? No, he did not. He defied the president and continued with those experiments, but he began moving his operations offshore to China out of the oversight by nosy federal officials and by the Cambridge Working Group, which was the group of 300 scientists that had been alarmed by his labs. And they had written Obama saying, one of his bugs is going to escape and it's going to cause a global pandemic. So they started funneling money to Wuhan, but it wasn't, Fauci, I think, put a total of 26 million in there. But the biggest funder was USAID, which is a CIA operation. So it was the CIA that was putting money into, and DARPA and other Pentagon agencies that were funneling the most money in for gain-of-function studies in Wuhan. And so then, I'm going to go back a little. During this period, and this is the chapter of my book that I think is most alarming to people, which is the CIA was sponsoring, beginning in May of 2001, 5 months before the anthrax attacks, they sponsored a series of pandemic simulations. And those pandemic simulations involved, all of them involved, there were CIA officials in each one. The CIA, they were James Woolsey, the deputy director, Avril Haines was at some of them, many, many other CIA officials who I name in my book. And each one of them had something in common. They ignored the pandemic preparedness protocols that had been agreed upon by the CDC, by WHO, by the European Medical Agency, by the National Health Service in the UK, of what do you do in a pandemic, because all of those protocols said you never lock down the public. You look for therapeutic drugs that are off the shelf, that are effective against these diseases. You get people to strengthen their immune systems. You quarantine with vitamin D and zinc and these kind of protocols. You isolate the sick. You quarantine the sick. You protect the vulnerable, but you let society continue operating. That's what everybody in the health field agreed upon. But the military and spy agencies had a different pandemic protocol, which is outlined in these series, and I go through all of them in my book. And they were the inverse of what you would do of medicine. They were about locking down subjects, about using these pandemics as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls. And the last one of these was in 2019 in October. And it was hosted by Bill Gates, by Fauci, and by Avril Haines. And interestingly, by George Gao, who was the head of the Chinese CDC in New York City. And any of you, I'm sure a lot of you have gone and looked at this on YouTube. It's called Event 201. And the fourth simulation that day, the last one, is all about how do you use the pandemic as a pretense for clamping down for abridgments of freedom of speech, and particularly, how do you stop people from talking about a lab leak as the source of these virus? So this is in October 2019. None of us at that time had ever heard of COVID. We now know that COVID was almost certainly circulating by mid-September. On September 12th, the Chinese government kicked down the door of the Wuhan lab, brought in General Wei, which is the bioweapons expert from the People's Army, to run the lab, and removed all the gain-of-function studies from their public-facing websites and all of the genomic sequences from all the viruses. The Chinese government clearly knew that the virus was circulating in September. So a month later, you have this. That same week, Bill Gates, who was overseeing this simulation, bought 1.1 million shares of BioNTech vaccine, which later became the Pfizer vaccine. He then sold that, almost all that stock, 87%, 2 years later, at a $242 million profit. And a week after that, he publicly announced the vaccine didn't work. So this is what you call a pump and dump scheme. Because he was the guy who was on TV with his minion, Peter Hotez, who took $52 million from Gates for Gates made his institution. So you had the pair of them pumping up this stock for 2 years. and then dumping it a week before he goes on TV and says, oh, it didn't work after all. So this Event 201, George Gayo, who's the head, who clearly at that point, if anybody in China knew there was a virus, escaped. It was him. He's the coronavirus expert from China. He's the head of their CDC. He's engaged in an hour-long discussion with April Haines about how do we clamp down to stop anybody from talking about that this is a lab leak virus. How do we get the social media sites to censor people and deplatform them when they talk about that? April Haines says, we not only have to censor people, we have to flood the zone. This is what she said, flood the zone with authoritative voices denying the lab leak. That's what happened. And the New York Times, which is in this room today, printed that as gospel. Printed that. I'm not saying the reporter who was here, she did it. She's a very sweet person by all accounts. But the Times itself did, and it's irresponsible. It's not journalism. It is propaganda at that point. So, you know, what we saw was this involvement by, and then what happened? Vanity Fair. The people are saying, well, where did the virus come from? The press is all saying, whatever you say, we know, wherever it came from, we know it didn't come from the Wuhan lab. Right? So the government, Mike Pompeo, who's the head of the Department of State at that time, says, we got to do an investigation. He tells 4 of his agencies, find out where this is coming from. Vanity Fair does the article of what happened. In spring, intelligence, all of these 4 groups from the Department, from Foggy Bottom Department of State are in a room saying, holy cow, we figured out that the very experiments that could have created this were being funded by NIH and were being done at that lab. And a guy comes in from the intelligence agencies, Christopher Park, and says, shut it all down. We got to stop doing this. This is going to implicate the US government. And despite that evidence in Vanity Fair, the American press continues to report it didn't come from the lab, when obviously nobody knew. So then a year later, the Republicans in Congress are saying to Biden, you gotta figure out whether this came from the Wuhan lab. So Biden says, okay, we're gonna get the intelligence agencies to go look into that. And who does he appoint to run that operation? April Haines. Oh, she then publishes the whitewash saying, whatever happened, we can't figure it out. We do not know. And of course, I think it's 450 pages with 449 redacted or something like that. But I'm not going to stand on that. But I know when it came out, that's what it was. So, you know, we need to ask ourselves, Americans, about you know, what is the role of public health? Who is supposed to be running public health? And why are the intelligence agencies have any involvement in public health? You know, and at the same time, they've been practicing for year after year after year how to use a public health crisis to dismantle our Constitution, to clamp down totalitarian controls. They did it right out in the open, and it's all published. When COVID first hit, you know, where I live now in California, there were surfers on Zuma Beach, and the police were sent down there to get them out of the water, give them $1,000 tickets, and send them home so they could get COVID. Because they weren't getting COVID out there. We knew by then that COVID spread indoors. And we know that vitamin D, which is sunlight, comes from sunlight, protects you against COVID. So what we were doing was the inverse of medicine. The health department in Los Angeles went down to Venice Beach and scattered sand on the half pipe so nobody could skate on them to get them off the beach and into their homes. They went to Compton and they padlocked all of the basketball courts. And if they couldn't padlock the court, they removed the rim. And, you know, and they put people in a place where COVID was much more likely to harm them. And this is the only time in history, the only respiratory virus in history, where you would go to the hospital with symptoms of COVID and a positive PCR test, and the hospital would say, you go home, there's nothing that can be done. There's no early treatment. You go home till your lips turn blue and you can't breathe, and then come back here. And each time they did that, it was a super spreader event. This was the inverse of medicine. And you know, we need, if we have illness in this country, if we have sickness, we need to have a medical response and a public health response, and not the response where Americans feel that their civil rights are being taken from us. We need choice. We need choice. We need freedom. We need a media that is going to go back to its traditional role of speaking truth to power. I had a reporter last night say to me that she said, well, what if your words are misinterpreted by people? And I said, that's not my business. My business is to tell the truth. And, you know, Americans are adults. We're grown-ups. We live in a democracy. Part of the responsibility of living in democracy is figuring out what the truth is and then debating about it and thinking about it. And when the press thinks that their job is to protect you from dangerous misinformation, they are manipulating you. That is manipulation. That is not press. That is not journalism. It has nothing to do with journalism. The job of the press is to be the fierce defender of truth, no matter what the cost of that truth is. And I'm being given the signal now to sit down and shut up. So I'm going to say, I'll leave you with the last thought, which is that everything that we care about in this country, everything that made this country great, that made it unique, that made it an exemplary democracy, it all comes from one thing, which is freedom. And if we don't have freedom, we have nothing in this country. And there was a generation of Americans, and many of them were from this state, people like John Stark, people from right next door, Ethan Allen, and many, many others, thousands of people from this state who gave their lives during the American Revolution, who sacrificed their property, their wealth, their status, their relationship, so that we could enjoy the civil rights and the constitutional rights that made this country a great nation. And we cannot allow somebody to take those rights away from us. We have to be willing to make the same sacrifice that our ancestors made for us to make sure that our children enjoy those same rights, those same liberties. So thank you all for standing for liberty.
Hey. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. So we're going to open up the side for ventilation here to get some air. And I'd now like to introduce Carla Garricky, the head of the Free State Project, to open it up for questions.
Thanks for the introduction. For people who don't know, I'm the chair of the Free State Project, and this is my party, and I'm really glad you came, Bobby. We're deeply honored to have you here, and I personally actually asked folks if we could get you out here to come speak to us. We are Libertarians of New Hampshire, obviously the Free State Project, And we are also the modern peace movement. And I think that's where we truly have overlap. So I wanted to let everyone in the room know I have been collecting questions over the past few weeks and last night on the campground. And in the interest of time and logistics, I actually have a list of questions that we're going to go through that way. I believe we have about 30 minutes before you have to mosey on again. And so I'm just going to sort of start doing it. I hope the time works out. The first question actually does have to do with the modern peace movement. We, of course, everyone in this room really does love your anti-war position. We also have a lot of activists in the state who are working on Defend the Guard legislation. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it is a bill that's been introduced that would say that Congress, who has failed us, who no longer declares war, what Defend the Guard would do is it would allow states to say that we will not send our National Guard to foreign wars. As president, would you support that, or would you try to stop the states from doing that?
You know, I have never heard that proposal before. I think it's a really interesting proposal. I don't want to cop out, but I would want to think about it before I gave you an answer, but I'm happy to give you an answer. I need to think about that first.
Okay. Do you, how would you go about sort of reducing our footprint overseas, and perhaps how could we get out of this war in Ukraine?
I think it's going to be quite easy to get out of the war in Ukraine. I mean, we now know, we found out in the last couple of weeks, that President Putin and President Zelensky, our Prime Minister Zelensky, actually signed an agreement in April of 2022, and that the Russians were complying with that agreement. But they had already began removing their troops from around Kiev, and that Boris Johnson was sent there clearly, at the behest of the White House to sabotage that agreement. And that's not the first time we've done that. I mean, Zelensky, the involved nations, France, Germany, and Russia all agreed to the Minsk Accords earlier on. And in 2019, when Zelensky ran, he ran on the basis of signing the Minsk Accords. He ran as the peace candidate. This is a guy who is a comedian and an actor, which I'm not disparaging because that's what my wife does, so I'm not going to say anything bad about it. But he was not a politician, a veteran politician. Why did people vote for him? They voted for him because he was the peace candidate. And the Ukrainian people wanted peace. That's what they wanted. And as soon as he got into office, Victoria Nuland was over there pressuring him, along with people from the ultra-nationalist right within Ukraine, to pivot and to walk away from the Minsk Accords. And, we've now killed 350,000 young men over there that have been killed in that war. And I'm not an apologist for Vladimir Putin. It's a brutal war. It was illegal. He had other choices. We also need to look at our role in the provocations going back to 1997.
So I guess this is.
Oh, by the way, let me ask the second question. Answer the second question. How do we wind down the empire abroad? And the answer, we have now 800 bases abroad. The Chinese have 1.5 bases. I don't think the Russians, I don't know if the Russians have any now, outside of the Ukraine. I don't know if they have any. We have, each one of those bases is a platform for future war. And we were told that, in 1992, when the wall came down in Germany, and the Soviet, and Gorbachev agreed to dismantle the Soviet empire, we were told we were going to get a peace dividend. We were told that we were going to stop investing in billion-dollar stealth bombers that can't fly in the rain, and that we would bring that money home to build schools and roads and infrastructure and help lower taxes and help farmers convert to regenerative agriculture and all the things that we ought to be doing as a nation. But none of that happened. We were told that our military budget was going to go from $600 billion a year to $200 billion a year. And that would be enough to protect our borders, to arm ourselves to the teeth, to still spend more on our defense than any other nation in the world. We spend today more than the next 10 nations combined. We spend 3 times what China spends. It's not good for our economy, it's not good for our national strength, and it has not helped American security or safety. We are much more in danger because of those military adventures abroad. The reason we're going through, I'm going to have to go through all these X-ray machines and searches today. I didn't have to do that before we got involved, with these military adventures after in the late 1990s, in the Mideast. So it hasn't made us safer. It hasn't made us more secure. It certainly hasn't made us more free. We now spend, instead of $200 billion that we were promised, we now spend $1.3 trillion on all the military expenditures, and that includes national security. So we have, I think, 880 million pure military, 300 million on veterans, which we need to do, and then the rest of it on national security at home. And that is bankrupting the middle class in this country. And I'm going to wind down that. I'm going to very, very quickly. I'm going to wind down that, and I'm going to start instead rebuilding our industrial base in this country and focusing on giving Americans the freedom they need for entrepreneurial activity themselves.
Speaking of entrepreneurial activities, our favorite entrepreneur is actually Ross Ulbricht. So Ross Ulbricht was the founder of Silk Road. His mission in life was to try and reduce the harm of the drug war. He built a website and he allowed people to test their drugs, to pay with private money, and it was a way to try and reduce that harm of the drug war. I know at Bitcoin Miami, you actually did say that you would look into Ross's draconian double life sentence. This man was in his 20s, and they threw the book at him. They threw the Schumer book at him, by the way. And I was wondering if you've looked at the matter a little more and whether you'd be willing to go on record, if you were President of the United States of America, would you pardon Ross Ulbricht? As I said at the Bitcoin conference, if I will immediately investigate this when I become president. I will, and if I find that Ross Ulbricht was punished as an example, then I will give him clemency. Okay.
That is not consistent with American justice, and it's wrong.
Absolutely, and I want you to know that his mother is here. She has done the yeoman work over the years just to try and get this story out. I will say from a personal perspective, I'm originally from South Africa, and I actually worked on the Nelson Mandela stuff back in the 90s when he was freed, and I think that we should think about this notion of Ross's role sort of in the world as something very similar, that he should have international attention. People should understand that this was a grave, grave, grave travesty of justice. keeping in the line with sort of whistleblowers and our favorite little rogue folks, we also support whistleblowers fighting the system, people like Julian Assange, who is literally being tortured by the system, and of course Edward Snowden, who actually I invited personally to speak at Liberty Forum in 2016 from Russia. As president, what can we do to help these people? How can we change this? How can we get back on the right track? How can we actually understand that whistleblowers play an incredibly important role, and they should be heroes, not traitors?
I will pardon both Assange and Snowden. I'll tell you something. It's stunning to me that the American press and all the publishers in this country are not at the barricades demanding that Assange gets released, because Assange isn't even really a whistleblower. He was a publisher. He just published something. And that means that anybody who republished what he published, which is the New York Times and everybody else, why aren't their publishers also facing jail? And you know, the Congress has made the case for Snowden because Congress used the revelations that none of us knew about, that we were being spied on, that all of our personal data was being gathered and was being archived by the intelligence apparatus, and nobody knew it, all illegal. And Congress was shocked to learn it, and Congress went out and passed laws to protect us against that. So, you know, it's hard to make an argument that Snowden did something that was inconsistent with the most deeply held and the most idealistic American values and personal courage.
I'll give you a softball next. No, this is a softball. Would you consider appointing any libertarians to your cabinet?
Of course. I'm going to appoint people. I'm going to have every kind of diversity in my cabinet, and I want to hear everybody's opinions. And libertarians are so great for this country. I don't always agree with everything that people say, particularly when it comes to regulating the commons. But these are people who understand the importance of critical thinking and are constantly reminding us of our most deeply held values. So they need to be listened to at every level of government.
All right, now things are going to get a little harder. New Hampshire is a constitutional carry state, so we don't need a permission slip from the government in order to carry guns. Obviously, I'm sure you followed the discussions here about the gun-free zone. You're our guest. We wanted to accommodate you. We worked with your stuff. But there are also 13 other states that no longer require a permit to carry a gun. Do you think the Second Amendment, because you were talking earlier about all these constitutional things, and the second is a big one for us. So do you think the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms free from government permission slips?
Well, let me explain my view of the Second Amendment. I would probably be supportive of a less expansive view of the Second Amendment. I support the Constitution, and that includes the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court has given a very, very expansive view to the Second Amendment, and so that's what we live with. I think it's, I can tell you this, I'm not going to take away anybody's guns as President of the United States. I believe, there's a terrible, terrible problem in this country with school shootings and with other mass shootings. And we have to figure out a way, all of us working together, a way to deal with that issue. And yeah, I agree. I want to hear everybody's suggestion. I grew up in rural areas in this country. I grew up surrounded by people for whom their ownership of guns was almost existential in terms of their belief in this country. And it was so integrated, particularly into rural culture, that and because of that, and because of the very expansive Supreme Court rulings about the reach of the Second Amendment, I think the capacity, even if there was one, to reduce school shootings or reduce that risk by gun regulation just doesn't exist. And it's such a polarizing issue now at this time in history where all of us have watched all of our other constitutional rights under assault. And there's a lot of people in this country that rightly or wrongly believe that the reason that the Second Amendment is the only one that didn't come under assault in the last few years is because of the Second Amendment. And I'm not going to change that belief. And attempting to do so is just going to further polarize our country. And I want to bring people together. And I want to bring them together by focusing on the issues not the issues that separate us, but the values that hold us together, that we share in common. And those values, particularly at the top list of those values, is how do we protect our children? And how do we protect them from dangerous drugs? How do we protect them from the pharmaceutical industry, from toxins in our food, and from gun violence? And I think, what I will do as president is bring people together to talk about all the ways to do that. I have many, many ways to do that I've thought about, that my team is thinking of, but we want to include everybody in that discussion and reach those solutions through collaboration and rather than through antagonism.
Awesome. And a comment to that, I'm sure you're aware of this, but with Big Pharma, they don't want to look into the link between school shootings and RSS medicines. So, I would encourage you to at least look at that link, and then also perhaps as president commission some kind of something that we can look at, because I think it's fairly clear there is some correlation and causation.
Yeah, I've looked at this issue. And I've spoken about it, and of course I take a lot of heat, which I don't care about. But the one study that I've been able to find is a study that shows that at least 23% of school shootings that the shooter had a history of SSRIs. That is a correlation. It does not prove causation, but it's clearly something we ought to be looking at, if only for the fact that the manufacturers' inserts for those products say in black and white that they cause suicidal and homicidal behavior and ideation. And so there are other things that we need to look at too, which, the role of video games, the role of social media, many, many other things. But we need to do that in a scientific, evidence-based way. This is what NIH should have been doing. NIH is supposed to protect our children. It's impossible almost for a journalist to look into this issue because of the HIPAA laws. Mm-hmm. We can't find out whether those shooters were on SSRIs or not. And because of that, NIH is the only entity that can pierce that and depersonalize the data and tell us the answers, and they won't do it. And I suspect they won't do it for the reason that they won't study anything else that is going to potentially reduce the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical industry.
Many Free Staters and many of us in this room, including myself, support secession. Now, I like to call it independence.
The what?
Secession. Seceding. By way of background, the Free State Project exists because we do not believe we can reform D.C. We think that ship has sailed. I mean, I'm excited about you. I think if someone can do it, it's probably you. So, go do that. But in the event that we are not successful with trying to stop what is happening in D.C., we here in New Hampshire, many of us, but not all Free Staters, but many Free Staters, support states' rights and we support independence because the federal government is out of control and it cannot be reformed. If New Hampshire were to secede, and we are on that path, we introduced CA-CR 32 last year. It was a declaration that was a constitutional amendment, which meant everyone in the state of New Hampshire would have to vote for it at 67%. And it was 2 lines, and it said, can we peacefully secede from the federal union? As president, would you use violence to stop us if we did it here?
You know what? I'm going to answer that question with the same answer I give when people ask me about Taiwan, which is strategic ambiguity.
I'll take it.
I'm here. I'm running to bring our country together and to make people believe in their federal government again, and to make people love our nation, to make us proud to be Americans again. I want to move forward on that rather than the options that are going to, further fragment and atomize us. So, I want to go forward with that kind of optimism. I want you all to be proud of this country the way that I grew up in a country that I thought was the best country in the history of mankind. I want you to feel that way about it too.
So you said, I noticed they said we're out of time, so I'm going to do 2 quick ones. CBDC, the central bank digital currency, yes or no? No! And then you said optimism, and I want you to understand everyone in this room is filled with love and unity and optimism, and we want to support you. I'm probably going to become your Hillsborough County chair, and I'm a card-carrying Republican and a small L Libertarian, so yay for unity. Thank you deeply for coming and speaking to us. Thank you for understanding that we are also a voice, that we are people who are intelligent, well-read, and we really do see the landscape for what it is. And I'm so, so thrilled and so honored and so grateful that you came and spent some time with us here in the Free State.